Today we are talking with Dylan Israel, formerly Coding Tutorials 360. What's up, Dylan?
What's going on?
So we wanted to talk about 10 top signs of an inexperienced developer.
Yeah, and you're using the term inexperienced. I'm going to use the term terrible because you can have plenty of experience and still be a terrible developer.
Yeah, it's almost like you can have a developer who has 10 years of development experience, but it's really they're doing the first year 10 times. That's the way I like to think about it. So the first thing I want to mention is spaghetti code. So I think we all know what spaghetti code is. That's where you have these huge functions, bad variable names. You repeat yourself a bunch, and you have like lack of best practices.
Yeah, this is definitely probably the number one outlier for most people, what they would consider bad code or just a bad developer. And there's a lot of easy ways you can solve this. You can learn about sort of clean code principles to solve this spaghetti code and just have code. Clean code is probably the book I'd recommend a lot of people read and just start practicing these principles and understand self-documenting code at the end of the day.
I know it's easy to kind of get into this. Sometimes people call it lasagna code too, spaghetti code, lasagna code, whatever you want to call it. You're kind of so focused on one thing, kind of miss the bigger picture, and all of a sudden you have these really like your variable names are called temp and variable one and temp one, and then you have all this code that could be broken into smaller methods or smaller functions, and they're just in one huge function. It's easy to get into this rhythm, but what good thing about it is you can get out of this by taking your time and refactoring. So you can refactor the code, you can start putting in test cases. Obviously there is, if you don't have any test cases in your code, then that becomes more difficult because you might actually break something when you refactor.
I think I'm glad you brought up refactoring because oftentimes I'd say one of the things that showcases an inexperienced dev from a more experienced dev is the inexperienced dev just gets it to work. And like, it's like, the experienced dev may actually have those huge functions and the bad code, but then they look at it and say, okay, it's working. Let's refactor. Let's make this code readable and more maintainable.
Exactly. And yeah, you can get pretty much any type of code working, but I mean, that isn't any sort of rubric that it's good code if you get it working. So the next one is for asking for help. So I think this is near and dear to both of us because I think we've both asked for help. We've also given a lot of help to other people. One thing I think you should do is if you are stuck on something, you should ask help. I've asked Dylan for help on things. He's asked me for help. So I think that's
Yesterday.
Good. Yeah, so that's perfectly fine to do that. And also, I think we both have organizations that we work at that have great tech leads, or we've worked at organizations with great tech leads. So don't feel afraid to ask your tech lead manager. And I'll say one thing is be careful that you don't go to them for every little thing. That will show them that you're really needy and that you can't solve problems by yourself. But when you are legitimately stuck, it's okay to ask for help.
Yeah, and I think sort of my previous workplace had a like 15 or 25-minute rule. If you can't figure something out in 15 or 25 minutes, go ask somebody because we don't want you sitting there all day. If you're inexperienced on the subject matter of technologies, it's like, how do I do this? And you didn't do a basic Google search, there's going to have be problems. Yeah, and don't think that those tech leads won't tell you in the pull review, in the pull request of hey, this garbage you wrote. I get that it works, but let me tell you a little something about how we should actually do this.
Don't be afraid, and just try to figure things out for yourself first before you get into asking for help. And then it's a good idea always to help others as well. So don't let ego get in your way. Sometimes, if you have this idea of that you're better than everyone, that's not what this is about. This is about literally trying to figure out ways that you can help others. So really helping others and explaining information can really help you solidify that you understand certain concepts. So make sure that you do that.
Yeah, and I would say like these developers that have 20 years experience, probably the reason that they are still bad is because of that ego. They're like, dude, I was coding God 6 months in. I've been stayed a coding God. And like they never took the opportunity to get better and sort of increase their skill and level up their code.
Enough said on that. Also, I like this idea, the rubber ducky principle. I don't know if you've heard of this, Dylan. I think you have. It's like when you're stuck on a problem, you talk to a rubber ducky, kind of like explain the problem to them, and just talking to someone else about a problem will help you solve it. Sometimes just doing that with other people, and when they do that to you, when they're explaining their problems, it rises to the surface of how to fix it.
Yeah, and I think this has to do with like when you're silent, your brain will just sort of jump to conclusions. But when you start sort of verbally saying it, same thing when like you're reading an essay. I equate it to something like that. If you've ever written, we've all written essays, but you'll read it out loud and like, yeah, man, this grammar in here is looking a little harsh once you hear it. But it was your brain was sort of making it sound all right. So I think the rubber ducky principle sort of falls into that.
So lack of testing, this is what, when we first learn to code, I think testing is kind of put in the back burner. But when you get into a professional setting, most companies really emphasize testing, good or bad. And so you should understand how to create unit tests when you're testing small pieces of functionality, end-to-end tests. Some people think that end-to-end tests are more important than unit tests. So keep that in mind. Having a good end-to-end test framework is a great way to do it. Kind of be careful about the tests you write. You don't want to write bad tests. You can easily write a test that really doesn't test anything or just expects true. And I've seen tests in old systems that I've worked on that pretty much just always passed because they weren't written correctly. And then keep in mind when you are testing, there is ways to test the happy path, but make sure you kind of an inexperienced developer would only test the happy path, but see if you can find some of those edge cases and test those too.
One thing that will make me lose respect for a developer very quickly is when they say they don't have any tests because the business hasn't made it a priority. The business 9 times out of 10 only cares about features getting delivered as quickly as possible, and they then care when it blows up and breaks. So sort of as a professional developer, it is up to you as a professional to say, hey, this is why we have to handle these tests, and this is going to allow us to go quicker down the road when we do that refactoring, we add new features. And so towards the inexperienced and bad, they'll just let there not be any tests because they don't maybe want to set up the framework. They don't want to deal with it. Maybe that's not something they've done before, but testing is a crucial part of any developer's sort of tasks. This is just sort of on a side tangent. This is actually one questions I'll ask when I'm interviewing for roles is if what their stance is on testing. And if they say they don't do tests, I will end the interview. Because the type of places that don't do testing don't respect their developers' opinions, and they also are in a very like, we're just going to knock some crap out, it's not going to be quality, and we're just going to shoot it out there and deal with it. And then you'll be dealing with, if you work at a company like that, you'll be dealing with it at 3 a.m. when things are blowing up because software's complex. There's a bunch of environments, browsers, all that sort of stuff, and testing helps protect against that.
And it's good to be in a good, I guess during your career, you're going to find all sorts of organizations. Some will have like a really structured with a development manager that used to be a programmer, and they really emphasize technology and the importance of tests. And then you'll be in organizations that aren't. And yeah, keep that in mind. Also, one other quick note is there is ways to even kind of up your testing. If you have a really good DevOps organization in your company that has like a continuous integration pipeline, you can do some fancy things where all your tests are ran after every, and you can even get plugins for GitHub and things to do this too. Like every PR that you submit, that your tests are run first, and that you have rules that nothing is committed into your code base unless all the tests pass. You can also kind of have continuous deployment, and that will allow every time someone pushes a feature or a bug fix that gets deployed quickly to different environments and maybe even to production.
On that note, I've interviewed with a bank that does continuous integration, continuous deployment, but does not do testing, and it scared me beyond belief when I interviewed with them that was their stance.
That's crazy. Why would you do that?
Bank. like you're messing with people's money, man. Get some tests in there.
Well, this is kind of interesting, and I've interviewed people on both sides, but if you don't have any interest outside of work on being a developer or an engineer, then I think that can be a red flag. It's definitely not I would not hire someone like this, or this is a definitely no, but it would be kind of a thing that I think most developers who are looking, especially if you're someone that didn't have a traditional 4-year college degree, you really need to work outside of work, be an explorer. Create. You don't have to, but create blogs, YouTube channels, or just have a side project.
Yeah, I think it's a crucial way. I know, like for me, it's been sort of the key to my success is sort of going outside the box, building projects. And oftentimes people think you have to build these massive applications that people are going to know by name and stuff like that. But just being familiar with the latest and the greatest, and just sort of playing around with those technologies, just building maybe pre-existing projects in it so that you can talk about it is enough.
Exactly. And like I said, there is some developers that have been doing this for 20 years that, spend time with their family and kids outside of work. But I think it's always a good idea still to keep up with the latest technologies and be able to talk about it. I had a little preview there. I clicked a little soon, but a code output is low. So a good rule of thumb I've always heard is if you can try to push up a pull request every day, or if not a pull request, a commit to maybe a PR that you're working on. So create a branch in GitHub or Git or whatever version control system you're running. Start working on it, and every day make sure you commit a little bit of code to it or push up a PR. And what can happen is, and I've done this myself, is you have some days, and some days can be better than others. You might have a little bit of lack of motivation, you're tired, you can get easily distracted, and that might get some low code output. But just try to be able to write code every day, get used to committing the code every day, maybe keep them small. So in good organizations, your tech leads, you might have someone that constantly is looking at the code base, might be looking at every PR that comes up, and little snippets they can diff between the two and see the changes that you're doing.
I think PRing is one of the best skills to have as a developer. Not only being able to have the sort of good communication skills to go along with giving feedback and getting feedback with it, and I think it's crucial, as you mentioned, to have a reasonable amount of code to go through. Sometimes people submit 100 file PRs, and it's like, all right, well, I guess I'm doing this the next 2 weeks, like, and that's a bit unreasonable, but one thing I wanted to mention, as I've had this issue at pretty much every organization. Like I personally love doing PRs, but sometimes developers avoid them like the plague. They just think that it doesn't provide value in terms of like what they output. So I think you have a lot that you can learn from PRs. You not only get exposed to other coding standards, but you also save yourself time and energy so that you can say, hey, let's clean up some of this spaghetti code and this is how. And because one day you may be working in that repo, and so you need to not only be submitting PRs, but you should also be reviewing them as well.
Exactly. And you'll find organizations, and hopefully you're not in this organization if you're listening to this right now, that commit everything to master and they don't create pull requests. That's really not good. Maybe if you're like a one-person team and you're just writing code by yourself, it's okay to just commit everything to master. But once you get more than one developer, you should be creating pull requests. The other person should be reviewing them, and then it'd be pushed into whatever branch that you're looking at.
Yeah, that's some side project shit. Like that's like if you're working at a company, you get your experience, you get out because you ain't gonna be a better developer a year later with them pushing straight to master.
Exactly. So this is really tough and to not do, but it's really easy to over-engineer simple problems or overcomplicate things in the sake of to be fancy or to maybe create your code very succinct. For example, I created a video a couple of days last week where I discussed a different way to do switch statements using objects. I think the consensus was in the comments is that it was a little overcomplicated, and that if I would have just stuck with switch statements, then that would have been fine. So that might be an example of maybe taking a simple problem and over engineering it, making it overcomplicated. And this is kind of a fine tune because you still want to use abstractions. You still want to make succinct code. You don't want to, if you could do something in 5 lines or 300 lines, you might want to do 5 lines, but you want to make sure the code's still readable and understable.
I haven't actually heard the KISS acronym. Keep it simple, stupid. Okay,
Yep.
all right. I've never heard KISS actually as an acronym. Yeah, I think that's important. I think oftentimes I've worked with developers who are very sort of combative to changes sometimes, and like this is the way they've always done it, and it's like, well, you need to change and there's better ways of doing it. Sometimes people want to over engineer because it makes them feel better. They're like, well, what if in this one edge case, and if you're following like clean solid principles, you don't need to code for that edge case now. You need to simply make sure that you follow the open close principle where it's open for extension and closed for modification. If you do that, you don't need to over engineer anything.
So you want to keep your code in a way you, as exactly Dylan said, you want it extensible. You want it to be able to make changes to it, but you also don't want it at the point where it's so rigid that you can't make any changes, or it's so over engineered that it's super complicated and you're looking for edge cases and features that'll never happen.
Yeah, this is especially important with APIs because you find that APIs start introducing breaking changes all the time because they aren't following. They're doing very little planning forward, or they're doing so much that if it don't things don't go as they expected, now they've introduced a breaking change and a new version has to be released.
So one thing we also want to keep in mind is not to rely too heavily on copy pasted code. This is kind of really easy, especially for new developers when they just start out. It's really easy to start going to Stack Overflow all the time, that's supposed to be 2 words, by the way. And performance, documentation, try sample app first. So what I mean by all this is that if you find some copy pasted code online, make sure you test it out, see if there's some documentations with it, make sure you understand it before you put this into your application. It's not good practice to copy and paste stuff and just put it right into production.
Yeah, definitely. And this is where testing comes again. Is like you can write tests against that to make sure that it does exactly what it's supposed to do. And sort of in the same note of this is I find that a lot of inexperienced developers have libraries and like NPM packages for things they don't need to do. And it adds not only does it add complexity because you don't ever actually learn how to build certain aspects of applications, but it also increases the size of the JavaScript. Whenever you're using like these additional npm packages for whatever it is that you didn't want to do, oftentimes they're very bloated and they have additional things. But I would say that sort of falls into this same area as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Anytime you add some more code into your application, the bundle size is going to increase. It's going to increase your load times. So keep an eye out for it. I've seen a lot of times, yeah, really bad uses of npm modules, which could, you just spent a little bit more time, you could probably figure it out, not bring that whole module in. On the other hand, there's sometimes where there's great libraries out there that makes it much easier. For example, in the Vue world, there's awesome libraries that can do forms and searching and things like that, which that might be an example of something you do want to add in.
Yeah, you shouldn't be completely anti open source or anti library, but I mean, one thing that always comes to mind that I'm an absolute hate is Lodash. Lodash is just one of those things where people have just decided that they're just going like there's functions for literally everything to get the first value of an array, get the last value of an array. It's like, and all of a sudden you're importing all this JavaScript for something that you really just part of the language.
I've been guilty of that, of adding Lodash. Actually, the last project I worked on, the developer was like a Lodash expert, and everything was written with Lodash in mind. And I definitely think some of that probably could have been written in plain old JavaScript. That's a good point. I don't think I've seen this happen too often, but inexperienced developers will definitely get offended during code reviews. And they don't do a very good job at code reviewing other people's work. Definitely, anytime someone code reviews your work, you got to take it with a grain of salt and take it as a learning experience. Especially really good developers, they can be very meticulous. They may give you some really good feedback. So just don't take it personally, but take that feedback to make your code better. And usually, most of the time, their feedback is just little things. Well, it just depends on the situation, but I haven't seen too many code reviewers saying, you need to rewrite this whole thing. But there might be like, you could do this better this way, or, you left a console log in here, which is probably not something you should have in production. There's probably fine lines where you get someone that could be super pedantic and not as helpful. But in other words, they're trying to nitpick every little piece of code, and you kind of take that for what's worth. Some people might be like that.
Oftentimes people are coming from a good place, and so you have to sort of not be afraid to take some criticism. And at the same time, if you truly believe that what they're suggesting is worse, it's okay to argue your point as to why, right? code reviews are oftentimes suggestions, not sort of dictation. Like no one's dictating that you have to do these things. These are suggestions, and you have to just remember everyone's on the same team.
I think I watched a video about someone who was with Google, and they said for a lot of their engineers, the first pull request, the first commit they do into any repository, they have a very strenuous code review process where they will, they won't let any code go out without 100% test coverage. They won't let any code go out without, at least 2 people double checking the code, making sure it makes sense. And they are very, very pedantic. They're going to be criticizing every little piece. So that is all I have. So those are my 10 things. So I think I'll go through them real quickly one more time. So spaghetti code, avoid the spaghetti code. One thing I don't know if you mentioned about this is to create a technical design document. That's always a good way to kind of avoid spaghetti code too. So if you do have a huge feature you're working on in your code base, you can try to sketch out the different components, sketch out how you're going to break the different components up. I'm assuming this is like web development or even a larger back-end code. You could try to sketch out where the different pieces are, maybe even make some kind of UML diagram if it's databases, things like that, and do that before you start the code.
Yeah, assuming you get acceptance criteria and requirements in a timely order manner.
Oh yeah, that's definitely a different issue altogether. You'll find often, I think Dylan said this in a channel, you usually have product people and then you have developers, and what the product people want to give you, usually isn't detailed, outlined, specific requirements. There's a lot of guessing involved sometimes.
Yeah, go and do it. What do you go write a book? What do you want to be on? I don't care. Go write a book, and then you write a sci-fi. I wanted a history book. I was like, God.
Exactly. Asking for help. So you should always ask for help, especially if you're stuck. But you should always help others. So people who never help others is kind of another bad sign there. Lack of testing, no interests outside of work. Keep those side projects in mind. Your code output is low. Simple problems are super over-engineered or complicated. Your code becomes very complicated. Probably goes back to the spaghetti code. Rely too heavily on copy-pasted codes. You're not really understanding what you're putting in. I think there's also another term for that. Bike shedding.
In college, they called it cheating.
Cheating, yeah. And getting offended during code reviews. No, don't take it personally. Anything you want to add, Dylan, before we wrap up here?
One thing I would say when it comes to sort of experienced developers versus inexperienced is to understand that your code doesn't, your job doesn't end for that piece of code once it goes through PR. Oftentimes you're going to want to make sure that the CI builds properly. Sometimes it doesn't. Oftentimes you're going to need to assist the quality assurance guy if you have someone doing QA, and just sort of understand that, and that sometimes I would say the majority of developers just leave their code like, oh, I got merged, I'm done with this shit, and they they go on to the next thing.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about like the role, the process, kind of the interpersonal skills you need as a software developer, especially working with QA and other teams, and having ownership of that code beyond when you commit it.
Mm-hmm.
That might be a video for another time. We could talk about that. I'm sure you've talked about it a bunch on your channel too. So where can people reach you at, Dylan?
YouTube.com/coding tutorials 360. That's always a good place. That's where
Awesome.
Most people can find me.
Awesome. If you guys like this video, make sure you share with others. Leave a comment below. Let me know, what coding practices do you guys follow? Have you dealt with inexperienced developers? Would you consider yourself an inexperienced developer? Let me know in the comments below, and how you're improving that. Thanks, everybody.
You can catch Eric and I both in our joint Facebook group, Code Tech and Caffeine.
Oh, that's exactly right. Yeah. So if you've looked through this list and you felt like, hey, I've done a few of these things, and you want to kind of join a group of like-minded individuals, not saying everybody in our group is inexperienced, but people who are also learning, who have the passion for programming and development. We have an excellent Facebook group called Code Tech and Caffeine, and yep, the link is in the description. Thanks, everybody.